Well, hello and welcome to the latest Families for Depression Awareness webinar. You are here for Depression and ADHD in Adolescents, a parent's guide to understanding and support, and we are thrilled to welcome you. I'm going to talk a little slowly for a little bit, let everybody get in. But we are thrilled to have you here with us today. And my name is Susan Weinstein. I am co-executive director at Families for Depression Awareness. We've got about an hour and a half scheduled for this webinar. And we will have opportunities for you to put in your questions. And also we've got the chat active. So if you want to say hello and put in where you're from, that'd be great. It's always nice for us to know where people are tuning in from. I myself am in Massachusetts. Have been for several years, but more today. Looks like people are filling in just fine. So I will go ahead and move along a little bit. So I would like you to know that we are going to be recording this session. So if for any reason you need to leave, or if you want to share it with someone, it will be available on our website. We'll be sending out an email to you after the program, probably tomorrow. And it will have the link to the webinar, and that should make it easy for you to visit it and share it. What else? If you have questions that you want to ask us, you can put them into the Q&A, which I think you should have available. If you don't, put it in the chat and we'll figure it out. But also keep an eye on the chat. I'd suggest that you open it and leave it open, because we're going to be dropping in information and links and places to download our fact sheets and all kinds of things. You can also download the slides that we'll be sharing. So keep it open. I think that's a good idea. I think it's a good rule for you. And you know what? It's probably a good rule for me too. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for myself as well. But we would love to start with a poll to just get a sense of, where you are in terms of your supporting teens. So how confident are you in supporting teens who are living with depression and ADHD? We'll take, about 30 seconds to let you answer with your own input. This will give us a good understanding of, where you are in terms of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And we always love it when people are on the lower end, because we're going to ask you later, and hopefully you'll be in the higher end. We are thrilled to see that, almost a little more than 2/3 are feeling somewhat confident. There's a little bit in the non-confident. And we've got a very few people in the very confident. So you guys are in the right place. I'm thrilled. This is great. Very happy to have you here. Hope that even those of you in the confident and very confident get something out of it. I think you will. All right. I'm going to assume that that's closed. And I'm also going to move ahead in the slides. Okay, so Families for Depression Awareness. We help families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. We've been around since 2001, and we've been doing webinars since 2010. So we are way ahead of the COVID craze. We believe that depression and bipolar disorder affect the whole family. Sometimes that's the genetic component where the children have, maybe more of a predisposition to getting a mood disorder. but also just in terms of regular life. When one person is struggling with depression, it's going to impact everyone else. It may be that, you know, the partner needs to do more of the household stuff, or, you know, carpooling kids, or whatever it happens to be. But we want to make sure that everyone has the chance to have their needs identified and addressed. Nationally, we provide education, training, and actionable advice. And in Massachusetts, we have a suite of programs that you can learn more about on our website, which is familyaware.org. We've got a wealth of information available. We have expert interviews, we have family stories. Storytelling has always been part of the way that we've approached education and awareness. We hope that people find, you know, inspiration, education, and also just the feeling that they're less alone. Caregiving can be a challenging and isolating experience, but you should know that there are other people who are in the same kind of situation as you, and there are people who've gotten through it. And we always try to share those stories, and it's thanks to our volunteers that we are able to just continue to provide more and more stories. If you have your own story that you'd like to share, then by all means, go to our website and fill out our volunteer form. We also have some great videos. We've got downloads. We've got online tests. One of the ones that I enjoy is talking about the caregiver stress test, which most people say, yeah, I already know I'm stressed. I don't need to take a test to tell me that. But what it does is it measures on a scale, and then we give you some resources that can help you manage that stress better. We also have publications, and there's a QR code on the screen, and scanning that can help you to sign up for our monthly newsletter. We always love it when people do. It's a great way to keep in touch. We are very often producing new content. We have an active blog. We also have active social media. So I hope you'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, or on YouTube. We're also on X for the time being. So for the program today, we're gonna, I'll pass it over to our featured presenter, and he will talk about understanding ADHD and depression and recognizing symptoms, ways that you can support the teens in your life, effective treatment options, which is always wonderful that we get to talk about things that can be effective. We'll go to questions and answers. And then we'll give you the survey that we hope you'll stick around to take. In terms of the questions, we have the questions that people submitted during registration, and we're also accepting questions as we go. So, and then we'll bring them all up toward the end. So it is now my privilege to introduce our featured presenter, Carlos Yiguez. He is a postdoctoral fellow through the Seattle Children's Research Institute. He received his doctorate in clinical child and adolescent psychology from Florida International University and completed his pre-doctoral internship at University of Washington School of Medicine. His research primarily focuses on refining and developing person-centered, scalable, and cost-effective interventions to reduce long-term risk for suicide and other deleterious developmental outcomes. Carlos describes himself as a translator working within interdisciplinary teams to build consensus and translate knowledge from basic science into clinical practice. Carlos is currently exploring 4 areas that he identified as having high translational impact. 1, examining sleep and how sleep interventions impact emotion regulation processes and risk for suicidal behavior. 2, conducting cost analyses to identify the scalability and cost effectiveness of promising or well-established interventions for youth. 3, characterizing risk for suicidal behavior among subpopulations at elevated risk, such as racial and ethnic minority youth, and youth with ADHD. And this is to inform tailoring intervention strategies to meet their needs. And 4, working with community providers to co-develop strategies to flexibly implement evidence-based interventions for youth in crisis. And it is my pleasure to go ahead and turn it over to Carlos. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and get to present. So I'll be talking a lot about understanding ADHD and depression. And we can start with our first poll just to get to know everyone is right now, if we could ask, are you currently supporting a teen that's living with depression and ADHD? Okay. So for about nearly half, it seems like yes. For the other half, no. And then there's some percentage of I'm not sure. So I'm hoping that some of the things that we covered today can help clarify what ADHD and depression are for some folks and whether additional evaluation is needed to increase that certainty about whether you're supporting a teen that may have both. So as a quick overview, we know that ADHD and depression together is actually very, very common. It just may look different in different people. We know that both conditions are manageable and that there are numerous treatment options available that are well established and scientifically based. And we know that individuals with ADHD can learn skills to prevent depressive symptoms and ultimately to prevent suicides. So what is ADHD? ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is one of the classes of psychiatric conditions, and it's characterized by elevated levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. We know that symptoms start in childhood. They have to start before age 12, and they persist into adolescence in about 70% of cases. And in over half of cases, they also persist into adulthood. We also know that ADHD is the most common psychiatric condition among youth, in that it affects 11% of individuals, of youth in the US, according to the CDC. We also know it's more commonly diagnosed in boys than girls, and it's associated with really significant academic, interpersonal, and family difficulties. What about depression? Depression is considered an episodic affective disorder. And that word episodic just means that it comes and goes in waves or episodes. Typically, a wave of depression lasts a minimum of 2 weeks, and it's impairing to a person's functioning in life. The key symptoms of depression, of which folks have to have at least one for a diagnosis, is to have a depressed or irritable mood. Irritable being an important factor here. For youth, it could include irritable mood. For adults, it's usually just depressed mood. Another symptom is loss of interest in people or activities that youth previously enjoyed. You might have heard this referred to as anhedonia by other folks. There are some behavioral and physical symptoms like changes in appetite and weight, disturbed sleep, whether it be too much or too little, and fatigue. And there are some cognitive symptoms like feeling hopeless or guilty, having trouble concentrating, and thoughts of suicide or self-harm. And unlike ADHD, depression is much more commonly diagnosed in girls. They represent 2 out of 3 kids that are diagnosed are girls. So thinking about what these look like together, I'll take one symptom that comes up in both: trouble concentrating. Is it ADHD? Is it depression? Is it both? Is it neither? And how do we know? We know for youth with ADHD, concentration difficulties are persistent, and they're most noticeable for non-preferred tasks. A non-preferred task can include completing homework, doing a science fair project, doing chores, anything that a teen would prefer not to do. However, inherently rewarding tasks can lead to hyperfocus, so more focus than you would expect. For example, teens with ADHD who play video games, I often hear from parents that they can pay way more attention to that game than other teens. And often the problem is that they aren't aware of their surroundings at that point. So you might call out to the teen, and they won't hear you because they're so focused on their game. So for ADHD, concentration is really task dependent. For depression, concentration difficulties are worst when someone is feeling really depressed. And the difficulties lessen as mood improves. And so the concentration difficulties you see in depression are really mood dependent. So they can come and go as someone is struggling with the most emotional parts of their symptoms. Whereas with ADHD, they're based on the activities that they have to do and not so much on how they're feeling. When it's both, you can see how attention can be especially confounded. You might have someone who is not motivated and feeling very depressed, and their attention is even less than when they had ADHD. And we also know that not everyone has perfect attention. Attention sort of waxes and wanes with motivation, things going on around us, whether we got good sleep. So many times, having some difficulty with attention does not necessarily mean that someone has ADHD or depression. So it could really be neither. Some disparities in diagnoses. So what do we know about how youth get diagnosed? We know that an accurate diagnosis of ADHD is essential for effective treatment because a diagnosis tells us a lot about which evidence-based treatments we want to map on to some of the difficulties that youth have. We know that ADHD can be overdiagnosed. When you look at folks that completed a research diagnosis using the most evidence-based practice for diagnosis compared to a clinic, in a community clinic, Black youth are more likely to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder rather than ADHD. So there's some bias here where symptoms might be viewed as a conduct problem and not an attention and neurodevelopmental problem. Also, we know that people might be diagnosed with ADHD if they have milder symptoms because they're seeking medication for treatment, and you need a diagnosis for medication. However, ADHD can still be underdiagnosed. For example, girls with ADHD are often diagnosed with depression or adjustment problems rather than ADHD. And so the difficulties that they're having that are neurodevelopmental in nature, some folks may be biased and consider them to be emotional in nature and assign an emotional condition such as depression or an adjustment problem with anxiety and depression rather than ADHD. Adolescence presents a really important developmental window of opportunity because there's so many changes that are happening in adolescence, and it's really a great time for us to intervene. Within the ADHD world, we know that childhood symptoms, so as kids are younger, their level of symptom severity and their impairments are generally not predictive of long-term outcomes. However, adolescence presents this critical developmental period for determining whether ADHD is going to persist into young adulthood and what kinds of impairments someone might have. Within depression, we know that symptoms usually start and rise sharply in adolescence. It's much more rare to find a much younger child with a depression diagnosis. And we know that adolescence is marked by a bunch of life transitions that can be really hard and bring about the onset of depression, like someone's first breakup, having a really hard time with secondary school, things like that. So there's a real opportunity to help youth learn to reduce stress and to increase rewarding experiences here. So we can talk about common symptoms and impacts. So what are some overlapping impairments? I'm going to go through some of the challenges faced by both and when they overlap and when they might not, including in academics, interpersonally, with family, trouble sleeping, which is an area that I'm really interested in, and then some risky or otherwise ineffective coping strategies. Starting with academic challenges, this is really a vicious cycle. We know that academic challenges are influenced by executive functioning difficulties that are really characteristic of ADHD, like trouble with organization, time management, planning multi-step projects. We know that this is also the most common argument for teens with ADHD and their families. and it can cause individuals to feel significant stress and can lead to depressive symptoms. We also know that depressive symptoms can make someone feel less motivated and engaged with schoolwork, which can influence how much people argue about schoolwork and can influence someone's grades. And so when someone has both ADHD and depression, this may result in really severe academic avoidance or sometimes even in school refusal behavior where kids don't want to go to school at all. How about interpersonal challenges? Here, we look at the real and the perceived difficulties. So, what we can observe in a classroom or in a group of friends, and what teens report as their experience of difficulties. We know adolescence is a period of really growing independence, developing your identity. We know that social networks become reorganized, and teens really take charge about who they want to associate with and who they want to go out with. What we know for teens with ADHD is that they're often viewed more negatively by their peers, even when social skills don't differ. So when teens with ADHD have typical social skills, their peers will rate them more negatively, likely due to disruptive behavior that they might experience in the classroom. For teens with depression, we typically see them report dissatisfaction with their friendships and lack of connectedness. They might be hypersensitive to experiencing rejection. They might choose to withdraw from others, and they may engage in reassurance seeking, like asking their friends, is everything okay? Are we good? Are we fine? And we know that teens that have both, right, can be really challenging when you have a teen that is both negatively viewed by peers and then is internalizing those messages, asking for reassurance, and then very sensitive to rejection that is happening. That can create some extra challenges and make things feel much worse. Family conflict. This is both a consequence, so an impairment, but also a risk factor. We know that teens with ADHD experience a lot of negative attention. This is true from peers, from family members, from teachers, and this just means that they often get told things that they might be doing wrong or something that they have messed up, or they get corrective feedback, even if it comes from a good place. And it often outweighs the positive attention that they have. And that's true for children with any behavioral difficulty. And we know that problem solving can be difficult to attain due to high conflict and then disengagement, which can lead to additional stress and can make someone feel depressed. Teens with depression, on the other hand, they may perceive their family as unsupportive, they may withdraw, and they may be less inclined to share concerns. When ADHD and depression co occur, this can cause significantly more family distress that's characterized by both lots of arguments, but then also lots of withdrawal. Trouble sleeping. Before we get into trouble sleeping, I'm curious whether you feel like if you're supporting a teen or if you're a parent of a teen or a caregiver of a teen, does your teen struggle with sleep? This is a very typical answer, particularly in adolescents. Yes, they don't sleep enough. And oftentimes the reason for this is that in adolescence, teens have teens want to stay up later and later and later. That's just a neurobiological preference to stay up later in the evening. But the responsibilities that teens have become earlier and earlier and earlier in the day, like going to school, or if they get jobs over the summer. So we're cutting sleep by both ends. So that's very, very common. For teens with ADHD, we know that poor sleep leads to worse attention, happens to all of us. But when you have a teen that already has difficulties with attention, that could be really hard. It can also lead to difficulties with executive functioning. Those are those organization, time management, and planning skills, and also with mood. I often compare this to think of a baby that didn't have a nap. That irritable, sometimes sad kind of mood can also apply to older folks, including adults. We know that teens with ADHD often want to stay up later, even later than most adolescents. They have irregular sleep patterns, meaning they don't wake up and go to sleep around the same time every day, and they're more likely to have insomnia. For teens with depression, it can be really hard for them to fall asleep or stay asleep, meaning they wake up often during the night or wake up too early. And for some teens with depression, they oversleep, although this one's less common. It's more common actually for teens on the weekend when they don't have other responsibilities to sleep in much more. And we know teens with depression have an increased incidence of insomnia. Risky and ineffective coping. This can have really serious consequences. We know that the goal often for teens can be very simple, which is to reduce stress and increase rewarding experiences. And if you already have a lot of these academic, social, family impairments, teens are more likely to use these ineffective behaviors to reduce their stress or increase their level of reward. Things like substance use, which one of the consequences having significant substance use problems or involvement with the law as a result. Emotional eating, where teens can develop eating disorder symptoms, and risky sexual behavior, which has been associated with unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. So we need a really careful assessment to support diagnosis, especially for folks who feel unsure if their teens may have both. One thing that we always ask is, what is the timeline of symptoms? ADHD symptoms usually come first because they start in childhood, and depression usually starts in adolescence. In what contexts do these attention difficulties arise? Are they more task oriented? Like some teens are having trouble paying attention in school and for non preferred tasks? Or is it that teens are having most of their attention difficulties in response to a depressive episode or a lot of difficulties with mood? We can also ask what happens before or after a concerning behavior. Oftentimes, those things can shape a behavior. If there's a trigger or an antecedent, for example, and then is there a particular consequence that teens are looking for? In the example of school refusal, it might be that teens just don't know how to catch up. And if they refuse going to school, the consequence that they're looking for is they get to stay home and they don't have to feel so terrible about going to school and not knowing what's going on. What is the scope of the impairment? And is there overlap in what is making ADHD and depression worse, as we talked about in these kinds of cycles? One thing I will note is that neuropsychological assessment often provides very limited diagnostic insight. That's because neuropsych assessment occurs in these like pristine laboratory settings that don't really mimic real world settings. And so they don't tell you a lot about someone's attention span, for example, in a classroom compared to on a computer with no one else in the room. And so it has very limited insight into what we know. Oftentimes, reports from parents and teachers can tell us much more than a computer test. So, how do we support teens? Some general principles for how to support teens with ADHD and depression, with our goal again of reducing stress and increasing reward. I created an acronym, I call it ACEs. One is attend. So focus your attention on the positive. Others have referred to this as catching your kids being good, pointing out good things that they're doing, and being very specific about the way that you praise. Another one is collaborate. So every house has their house rules and their limits, but you can apply those flexibly within those limits so that teens feel like they have more of a voice and more autonomy in the decisions that they make. Sometimes teens that have some behavioral challenges or depression or ADHD feel like they're being controlled and told what to do all the time. Also, encourage positive experiences. So activities that teens enjoy and that they want to do just for fun, like being part of a club, going outside if they like to go outside, artistic endeavors, anything that can just be fun. And also supporting a sense of mastery. Those are activities where, in addition to potentially being fun, um, teens can build a sense of accomplishment that they've done something. I've often heard people use exercise or playing an instrument or playing a sport as something where people not only do they enjoy the activity, but they feel really accomplished, like they're meeting some goals that they have for themselves. Another way that we can support teens is to build a care team, especially when teens have more than one condition, which is usually the norm and not the exception. Having a team of folks that all work together can be really helpful. Parents and guardians are generally the most important partners. Um, you can also collaborate with your child's school to determine optimal supports. Um, so you can receive, for example, specific accommodations through Section 504. Those are for teens, for example, where extended time or preferential seating or um, reduced homework can go a long way in helping teens catch up academically. And then if you suspect that you need additional supports or that there might be some learning difficulties, you can request from the school to provide testing for IEP services. So school districts, particularly public school districts, are required to provide testing when learning disorders are suspected. And they can create an IEP or an individualized education plan that has very specific goals and strategies in place to help remediate some of those difficulties and help kids become successful in school. Another part of your care team can be your medical provider. That could be your child's pediatrician, it could be a psychiatrist, and they are there to address any medical concerns that might be contributing to some difficulties with depression or attention, and also to manage any medication that might be involved. So, what are some effective treatments for ADHD and depression? We know that the general rule of thumb is that combined treatment approaches lead to the best outcomes for teen wellness, regardless of condition. This is true for ADHD, depression, anxiety, any condition you can think of. And what combined treatment means is that you're combining mental health therapy with some form of medication. For ADHD, we're thinking stimulant medications. And for depression, we know that SSRIs, or antidepressant medications are really evidence-based at reducing depressive symptoms. One thing that we also know now is that stimulant medications actually reduce suicide risk in teens with ADHD. And that's a finding that recently has been replicated a lot in the scientific literature. So that combination of a stimulant medication and treatment for either ADHD or depression can often be a very winning combination for teens. So, what are some treatment goals? Mental health therapy can be a lot of different things. And so we have to prioritize what our goals are so that we can tailor and personalize these goals for our teens. The first goal should always be safety first. So, addressing any concerns that have to do with suicide or self harm, and working with your teen then to establish goals to reduce impairment. So, what are the areas, right? Whether it be academics, interpersonal challenges, family functioning, difficulties with sleep, how can we reduce those impairments rather than focus on the individual symptoms? Because, for example, there aren't any well established treatments that are going to improve attention span, for example. But there are treatments that exist that can help improve what a shortened attention span or difficulties with attention typically causes, which is trouble with academics. You want to work with your mental health team to establish those really personalized goals and to establish a unified treatment plan in collaboration with your care team so that everyone's on the same page about what we're working on. Um, the parents, the teens, their mental health therapist, their medical provider, if they're involved, and the school as well. If everyone is involved in addressing the issue together, um, you have a whole system now and a whole team working with you, and that can often lead to the best outcomes. So how do we focus on safety first? This first goal. We know that teens with ADHD and depression are more likely to have suicidal thoughts and behaviors than teens with ADHD or depression alone. So teens that have ADHD are actually 6 times more likely to die by suicide. So this is a really important topic. The first thing that we do is we start with a safety plan that is developed in collaboration with a mental health provider. And a safety plan helps give teens steps for what to do if they find themselves in a suicidal crisis. Oftentimes, teens know what not to do, but this gives them a roadmap for things that they can do to help those thoughts pass. You can identify what stressors make suicide and self-harm urges worse, so you can prevent them or know what to do if those stressors come up again. And if suicide or self-harm problems are recurrent, they're very enduring, they're intense. For example, teens that have multiple suicide attempts or self-harm very often, you might consider starting with dialectical behavior therapy. This is not a therapy that we're going to talk about for a lot of this webinar, but it is the only well-established treatment for suicidal thoughts and for self-harm. So in the spirit of safety first, if you feel like safety is an ongoing and problem, dialectical behavioral therapy focuses on helping with emotion regulation and has been helpful for teens with depression, with ADHD, and with all kinds of conditions. This is what the safety plan looks like. I won't get into too much detail about it. I see that Ari just posted in the chat where you can download a copy. Can't stress enough that this should be done with a mental health provider, but there's a 6-step plan that provides warning signs. So how do you identify those triggers? And then gives support and coping strategies that teens can use to help those suicidal or self-harm thoughts pass before they take any action. And then that very last step is to make the environment safe. So you work with your mental health provider to determine how you can improve safety, like locking up medications, making sure teens don't have access to firearms. All of those things are included in a really comprehensive safety plan. So what are the effective treatment options for ADHD and depression? For ADHD, there are a variety of cognitive behavioral therapies that focus more heavily on the behavioral than the cognitive. And some of the common components or the common elements of these therapies include contingency management, developing of certain skills, and enhancing some of these cognitive behavioral treatments with motivational interviewing and with parent collaboration. So I'll get into what that looks like now. So contingency management. Here, parents and teachers work with teens to reward positive behaviors and de-incentivize negative behaviors. So the goal with contingency management, is to develop consistency in rewards and developing certain routines, like a homework routine, a chores routine, a routine that's done in schools if teachers are implementing a contingency management program. It's all about rewarding positive behaviors to incentivize those and give more positive attention there, and de-incentivizing negative behaviors where teens don't earn rewards for those. Building skills. By far, the number one set of skills that teens develop in these programs are organizational skills. This also leads to a reduction in symptoms over time. So getting organized, making sure the backpack is organized, binders, agendas. We know that in adolescence is a really tricky time for individuals with ADHD because in elementary school, most teens have 1 or 2 teachers. And so you can put everything in one place. But when you get to middle school and high school, you have sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 teachers. And so being organized is really important and can affect you much more. So for adolescents, building those skills can really help reduce their attention symptoms. Kids also develop problem-solving skills to help address barriers to their treatment and being successful in different situations, primarily academic ones. And then Some treatments also help with the development of social skills, which equips teens to overcome interpersonal challenges. And these are often done in group formats where teens get to practice different social interactions with other teens in a safe environment. How do CBTs for ADHD impact other areas? So, if the focus is improving academic and social functioning, how helpful is this for things like depression? What we know is that academic and social challenges in the long term, they can predict substance use. Kids who are failing out of school or have significant challenges with um, interpersonal challenges with peers are more likely to use substances. They have higher rates of teen pregnancy, higher rates of delinquent behaviors and involvement with the law, and higher rates of depression and anxiety. So, in some sense, part of what these treatments do is that by improving academic and social functioning, we're preventing the escalation of these behaviors from happening. What about sleep treatment? We know that improved sleep improves attention, emotion regulation, motivation and engagement, and a whole host of other things, including mental health and physical health. For ADHD, a lot of the work has focused on melatonin because melatonin can help regulate sleep. I put a bullet point here to beware of over the counter melatonin gummies. Over the counter gummies that are not prescribed are not always regulated by the FDA, which means that the dosage is not always correct. And there have been studies looking at over the counter gummies that report to have a particular dose, but that's not the dose that people get. Oftentimes it could be less or it could be variable. And so if you're considering melatonin, I would always consult with your teen's medical providers about getting a prescription or talking through the pros and cons of using melatonin to help with sleep. There are CBTs that exist for sleep, but testing is really badly needed in ADHD. We just don't know a whole lot about how cognitive behavioral therapies for sleep impact ADHD. We just know that poor sleep is often associated with worse ADHD, and that kids with ADHD often have poor sleep. What about treatments for depression? So I put 4 here. One is behavioral activation. There are 2 CBTs, one for depression and one for insomnia, and then interpersonal psychotherapy. I am seeing in the chat someone saying ADHD meds tend to keep kids awake. That is true. And so I always tell parents to check in with your medical providers. ADHD medications can be administered at an extended release or a regular sort of dose. And so if kids are taking an extended release, one of those like 12-hour medications, you can consider taking either a lower dose or taking a dose that is more powerful in the morning and does not last as long. And that can sometimes help. I am not a medical provider, so I can't give specific recommendations for medications, but that is a very common side effect. And so that's just one example of how it's been addressed. In terms of these treatments for depression, these are the 4. I will note that cognitive behavioral therapy for depression and interpersonal psychotherapy are considered well-established treatments so that we know from the science that these are the most effective. We know behavioral activation is very promising, and that CBT that treats sleep, like CBT for insomnia, is also very promising to help treat depressive symptoms. So what is behavioral activation? Again, our theme here is how to decrease stress and increase rewarding activities. What behavioral activation does is you focus on increasing rewarding activities and to reduce avoidance. Oftentimes what folks do in this kind of treatment is anchor rewarding activities with teens' values. So what do teens want out of their lives? What are their most important values? And how can we have them engage in activities that are consistent with those values? That can help teens gain a sense of purpose and have more motivation to participate in these activities. And what kinds of activities might be rewarding? things that are just pleasant, so just time for fun, and things that are mastery oriented, like accomplishing a goal. Here, the picture of the teen learning how to play the drums can be a bit of both, right? It can be really fun, but you're also learning and feeling really accomplished that you're doing something, which is a really great feeling to have, especially for teens with ADHD, who often feel like they're behind in a lot of different areas. What are the goals of BA or behavioral activation? We teach kids the difference between a goal directed versus a mood directed behavior. A mood directed behavior is letting your mood dictate what you do. So sometimes teens will say, well, I'll go to my drum lesson when I feel better. And they just sort of wait to feel better until they re engage with a lesson or an activity or a chore or whatever it is that they were going to put off. And sometimes they don't feel better. And so those things don't happen and avoidance just persists. A goal directed behavior means I'm going to do this activity regardless of how I feel. And the goal is to try to feel a little bit better after doing the activity because you completed it. It could be a pleasant activity, it could be a mastery oriented activity, any activity that on a typical day you think would make you feel better. The goal is to schedule it and to have it be a goal and not wait for you to feel better to do it. BA also helps optimize short-term versus long-term goals. So how to break down activities into shorter-term goals in support of these longer-term ones. Developing SMART goals. So goals that are specific, that are measurable, that are attainable, that are realistic, and that are time-based. And then there's also space to problem solve any barriers to goal completion. So the big summary here is increasing rewarding activities to reduce avoidance. And we know from the science that you can help change a teen's mood by changing their behavior. By having that goal-directed behavior, you can change your mood. What is CBT for depression? How is it different? So CBT combines principles from behavioral activation with cognitive therapy, where you identify unhelpful thought patterns and more helpful thoughts, and you show how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected together. So you show how thinking you're behind in school and feeling depressed and then not wanting to go to school, how all of those things are connected. One important factor that I consider when I think of CBT for depression is that cognitive skills can sometimes be really challenging for individuals with ADHD to think about their thinking. And so oftentimes when I work with teens with ADHD and depression, I lean with the more behaviorally focused treatments because they're more straightforward and they're more about action. Just to bring to life what cognitions are, you've heard this term cognitive behavioral therapy a lot. Cognitions are just thoughts, just a fancy word for thoughts. And what most folks learn in a cognitive component of a cognitive behavioral therapy is that there's different kinds of cognitions. I like to use this tree metaphor where you think of initially automatic thoughts. This is just like a leaf on a tree. Imagine a leaf just falling on you. It might just land on you and you brush it off and it's gone. Or it might land on you and you might hold on to it, think about it some more, really examine it. That's what an automatic thought is like. These thoughts enter our minds all the time. We don't have full control over them. And they might stick around or they might fade away pretty quickly. When we get into the branches of the trees, this is when we get into thinking traps, which is when we have a repetitive thinking style. We think about something over and over in the same kind of way. For example, one thinking trap is called mind reading, which is when we think we know what other people are thinking of us, and you can see what implications that might have for our behavior. But in reality, we don't know, right? Unless we ask or unless someone volunteers that information. So a thinking trap is just a pattern of thinking that keeps us stuck. And a core belief is the most difficult to change, right? These are like the roots. A core belief could be something like, I'm never going to be successful, or I am not good at math. Something that's really core to how someone identifies themselves. And so you need a lot to be able to change those core beliefs in a CBT model to help someone improve their mood. And how do we do that? We introduce the concept of detective thinking, which is looking for evidence for and against different thoughts, to be really sort of really precise and realistic and factual in the way that we're thinking through some of these thoughts. We also help teens understand the difference between probability and possibility. There are a lot of terrible things in this world that are possible. And if we focus on all of those negative possibilities, you can see how someone can start to feel really sad or really upset. The likelihood of those things or the probability of those things happening, though, can be very low. And so we often have kids use their evidence to come up with probabilities of things happening. So if you focus on the likelihood of something happening and not on the possibility of all of these low probability events that are really negative from happening, oftentimes teens feel a little bit better. And we also think about thoughts in the moment. What's helpful in this moment right now? You're walking in to take a big test. You don't think you studied as hard as you could. If in the back of your mind, all you're thinking is, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, it's going to be really hard to take that test and be productive. So in that moment, even if that thought might be true, or you think it's very likely to be true, it's just not helpful. And so we can try to find a different thought to help us get through this tough time. So what is interpersonal psychotherapy? Interpersonal psychotherapy focuses on how interpersonal challenges or difficulties with peers or other social difficulties can otherwise impact our mood. We know that low mood and interpersonal challenges reinforce each other. For example, we talked about how when folks are depressed, they're more likely to withdraw, which creates challenges with their friendships, which might make someone feel more sad. And so it becomes this cycle again. So IPT really focuses on this social aspect of things. They discuss expectations within relationships and they teach communication skills. And teens often pick one area of difficulty to focus on at a time. Some skills include assertive communication, so being able to communicate confidently and communicate the things that you need. Using empathy when interacting with others, right? Giving a little to get a little. And then perspective taking, so understanding your perspective, but also the perspective of other folks that you might be having challenges with. And this is accomplished through a series of role plays, modeling, and analyzing previous difficulties with communication that might have happened in the teen's life and really dissecting it and breaking it down to see where you could have made a change to make a difference. CBT for insomnia. So this is an area that I'm very interested in. We know that insomnia is a common residual symptom. And that means that when you treat someone for depression, oftentimes sleep is one of those depressive symptoms that might still remain elevated. We know insomnia makes depression treatment less effective. So if someone has a high level of difficulty with sleep and with insomnia specifically, they might be less likely to respond well to treatments for depression. We also know that there's high recurrence of depression if sleep difficulties persist. So if someone after depressive treatment no longer is in a depressive episode and they're otherwise doing okay, there's a higher level of recurrence if they still have that residual symptom of having difficulty with sleep. Sleep difficulties also predict suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so it's really important to understand how can we treat sleep to prevent these things. And what's really great about CBT for insomnia is it can lead to positive outcomes in as few as 6 sessions. Most protocols do CBTI in 6 sessions or less. So what is CBTI? CBTI includes multiple components, including improving sleep hygiene, stimulus control, sleep restriction, which I'll get into. I know it sounds counterintuitive, relaxation exercises, and cognitive restructuring, which is very similar to the cognitive skills that we talked about in CBT for depression. So sleep hygiene and stimulus control. Sleep hygiene is taking care um, to feel sleepy around bedtime. We know that light and dark cues can really help us. So the natural rhythm that we have for sleep is really highly influenced by darkness. We know that our body naturally produces the most melatonin when it's in total darkness and when it's later at night. So having things like screens, a TV playing while we're trying to fall asleep, or any kind of artificial light can make that harder. Caffeine use, especially in the evening, can really make our sleep hygiene much worse. And one of the most common ones for people that already have difficulty with sleep is clock watching. That means you wake up at 2 a.m. randomly and you look at the clock and you say, I have 4 more hours until I have to wake up. And as you're tossing and turning, you keep looking, you say, now I have 3.5 more hours, and you're sort of counting yourself down. Clock watching is often one of the worst things that you can do. So I often tell teens and adults to make sure that you don't have clocks that are facing you, or that if you have your phone, charge it away from your bed so that you're not tempted to look at the clock. And the last one is stimulus control. So using the bed for sleep only so that your body gets used to the fact that the bed is meant for sleep. So that means not doing homework in bed, not watching too much TV in bed, not doing any other activities in bed, and saving that for sleep. If someone wakes up in the middle of the night, we often ask them to go to a different spot in their room that can be cozy and comfortable and do whatever activity it is that they need to do that is relaxing and calming, and then return to bed when they feel like they're sleepy and ready to sleep again. And that helps maintain that association that the bed is for sleep only. Relaxation and cognitive restructuring. So, cognitive restructuring involves addressing negative thoughts that contribute to sleep. These thoughts can be very specific to sleep, like I'm never going to be able to go to sleep, or there's something wrong with my body, or they can be thoughts that are more general, like worries about the next day. Did I complete all my homework? Do I have a test tomorrow? Those thoughts that are so common to individuals with ADHD and depression. And what we can do about it, one is to have relaxing activities. So encouraging calming activities before bed. This can include reading, mindfulness kinds of activities, listening to calm music, having some kind of calming routine before going to bed. And the last one is called savoring. So, savoring is when you think of something really positive in your life and you think about it over and over, almost like you were savoring a piece of food. We know from the science that savoring sort of flexes the same muscles that rumination or brooding, which are examples of thinking about something negative over and over again. Folks that can ruminate and think about something negative over and over and over again are usually really good at savoring, provided that they pick the right thing to think about. And it's something that's salient, and it's something that they can really think about, something they enjoyed, like a recent birthday, a victory that they had, time spent with a family member or friend, something that they can really think about, almost like closing your eyes and watching an episode of something important in your life on TV. And that can help someone, calm the chatter of those negative thoughts or worries, and help someone fall asleep. And then sleep restriction. So restriction involves setting a consistent sleep window and not sleeping within an hour of that set bed and wake time. The restriction part comes in is that we may restrict sleep initially to promote continuous sleep. So if someone has a bedtime window of 8 hours, but they're only sleeping 6, and they're waking up a lot in the middle of the night, we might reduce their window. So only have them sleep 6 hours, but making sure that it's all within a pre-specified window, and then slowly expanding that window so that everyone sleeps in one block rather than having sleep be sort of fragmented and in different places. So how do we put everything into perspective? We know that ADHD and depression co-occur frequently. and they can make each other's symptoms and impairments worse. Our goal for treatment should always start with safety first. So identify and treat suicide and self-harm risk first. We know that careful assessment can help with diagnostic clarity, but can also help personalize treatments. You can work with providers to take the elements from the treatments that you're using and really customize it to the difficulties that teens may have. And you can support teens by helping increase rewarding experiences and reducing stress in their environment. And this can be done by building a care team where you have folks from school, medical providers that can help make some changes in the environment, whether that be through accommodations and medications, and also some changes you can do at home to help support teens.
Well, that was phenomenal. I love it when we have programs that just offer so much practical information for people. I think that's one of our strengths, is that we really want people to be able to, finish the webinar, do the survey, and then, have concrete steps that they can take. And so, Carlos, thank you. You really hit so many important topics and gave a lot for us to think about and to do. Everybody, would you please let us know how confident you are now in supporting your teens living with depression and ADHD? We'll just leave that up for a couple several seconds. And we'll take a look at that. We will be getting to the questions and answers after I give you a little bit more information. So please stay on for that. And we'll also be giving you the link to the survey. Oh, it's right there anyway. Okay, let us see. Well, it looks like we had some movement up, which is great. We have most people feeling confident now. So that is something that we'd love to see. Anybody else who's, feeling somewhat confident, hopefully we gave you some things to launch off from and build your confidence. And I know sometimes it's hard to figure out how confident you are until you start trying it. So I'm hopeful that when you go and try out some of these things, that you'll say, look, I can be confident because I'm actually able to do it. All right. Okay, so if you could please take that survey, we'd very much appreciate it, because we really rely on the participants to tell us what, whether this worked for them, what are the things that we can improve. Your feedback really does matter to us. And also, if there are things that you want to see us doing programs on, let us know. Your input is really, really, really important to what we do. So please let us know. When you take the survey, if you complete it, you'll be entered to get a chance to win a $15 Amazon gift certificate. So, a couple of minutes of your time for the possibility of getting $15 at Amazon. I really want to extend a thank you, not just to Carlos, but also to the organizations that so generously provide us with funding so that we can do these programs and offer them at no charge to our participants. They currently include the George Harrington Trust, Middlesex Savings Charitable Foundation, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program, the Bennett Family Foundation, the Thomas Anthony Pappas Charitable Foundation, and the Rebecca Pomeroy Foundation. This is in addition to the very generous individual and family donors that we have. And if you are interested in supporting our work, I'd certainly invite you to visit our website, familyware.org. If you do /donate, then you'll get to the right page. Okay, I'm going to stop this screen share and let it just be us. All right, except that it's on my face. So here we go. So one thing I want to loop back on, Carlos, if you don't mind, is a lot of the goals are about reducing stress. That's not always possible, is it?
Depending on the stressor, there are so many things that can be very stressful for teens with ADHD or teens with depression or both, or for really any teen. If academic difficulties are a big stressor and a teen is just having a really hard time keeping up with the workload, um, schools are in a great position, for example, to give someone more time or to reduce the amount of work that they have to do so that they can support teens where they're at. And that can sometimes really reduce stress. Um, right? It won't be necessarily rewarding, but if you have more time, if you feel like you need it, or you have a bearable amount of homework that you can do at home, that can really help reduce some stress that is associated with ADHD and can even be associated with depression when someone is really depressed and is having trouble sort of getting up and wanting to go to school, right? Getting that little bit of a break can be really helpful at reducing stress in that kind of context.
And one of the reasons why I ask is because in our work, we say that we can't always control the stress, but we can work on our capacity to manage it.
That is also very true. So there are some stressors that we just that are completely outside of our control, right? There's nothing we or others can do. Um, and it reminds me of, right, those helpful or unhelpful thoughts. Like, what can we do in this moment that will help us have a bit of an easier time in the future?
Another thing that struck me was that when you were talking about ACEs, um, the S was support building mastery. This is a great time for my dog to start growling. It's the examples that you gave seem to be like working in groups. Is that a goal so that it can be combined with a social experience, or were those just examples that you gave?
Those were some examples. You could combine it with a social experience, especially if that's inherently rewarding for someone, right? They might be more interested in doing exercise and accomplishing that kind of goal if it's in a team sport, for example. Um, but for some folks, just having the feeling of I've accomplished something um, when they're in a depressive episode or when they have ADHD and they feel like they're behind in school or they're not getting along with friends, that sense of accomplishment can be done with any kind of activity, whether it's something that's done individually or something that's done in a group. I had a teen who his mastery activity was to help repair a car with his dad. And so his dad got him the tools that he needed, and the teen worked alone on the car, and his dad would supervise at a different time. But he got this sense of mastery, like I can do something with my hands, and like I did something for this car, and I feel really good about it. And the teen did it totally by himself, but was really, really interested in it. I'm seeing someone in the chat wrote gardening. That's another great one. Had a teen that liked to decorate birdhouses and like little houses for squirrels. Cooking, that's another great one. And cooking, a life skill. Um, art, yes, all really, really great activities and all have that mastery element, even though they can be fun in and of themselves. It's a skill and an accomplishment to prepare a dish for your family or to watch a plant grow or to, right, create a masterpiece.
Are there specific kinds of counselors who work with ADHD and depression, or are most counselors trained to do that?
The ADHD and depression are both some of the most common conditions, ADHD being the most common. And so most counselors have training in both. Oftentimes, counselors, you want to ask, right? Sometimes counselors will sort of split their expertise into folks that work on the internalizing side of things. And those are things like anxiety, depression, fears, phobias, and some who are more experts on externalizing things like ADHD, conduct problems, oppositional defiant issues, substance use. And so whenever you work with a provider, you just want to make sure that there's someone that has experience with both. Because that unfortunately that silo does sometimes exist.
There were a couple of comments in the chat earlier about the teens always being exhausted, And we had a question that came in before the program. How can you support a kid or teen who's exhausted by school from both depression and ADHD, overwhelmed, to attend and thrive? I mean, how common is this issue about the teens being exhausted, and how much of a concern?
Super common. And oftentimes it means that they're either not getting the right amount of sleep or their sleep quality is not very good. Parents are often shocked, or caregivers, at the amount of sleep that kids need. So I think most people will say that it's about 8 hours. That's the rule of thumb for adults. So the younger you are, the more sleep that you need. So in adolescence, it's really between 8 and 10 is sort of where you want to be. And that means totally asleep. That doesn't mean in bed. And so it's 8 hours of continuous sleep. And teens often miss that goal, right? I think we saw that in the poll that oftentimes teens don't get enough sleep because they want to stay up later and because they have to wake up earlier. And there are certainly a lot of things that can cause us to have poor quality sleep. There's a lot that goes on in our brain when we sleep, related to memory processing. And you can sort of think of like sort of the cleanup crew is what's active at nighttime in our brain. If the last things that we do are things that feel really negative or really difficult for us, that might impact the quality of our sleep. And it might be the first thing that gets plugged into our long-term memory. The dreams that we have might be really negative if we just had a big argument before going to bed. In fact, for younger children, creating that positive bedtime routine and experience can help reduce the intensity of nightmares, for example. So having that pleasant nighttime routine and getting enough hours of sleep are two really nice ways that you can help teens both with their quality and with the quantity of their sleep.
And ways to encourage them to get to school?
To encourage to get to school if they don't want to go to school, one, we got to figure out um, what is causing a teen not to want to go to school. And there's so many reasons. It could be because they're behind and they want to avoid getting a bad grade or um, feeling like they're so behind. It might be that there's something more rewarding at home, which means that we have to make home a little less rewarding to encourage teens to go to school and then um, give those rewards when teens go to school. It could be social difficulties like bullying, which are unfortunately common in individuals with ADHD and depression for them to experience bullying. So the first step is always that careful assessment of what is going on in school that someone doesn't want to go, and how can we make that, what can we do then to make it easier?
Okay, thank you. Is ADHD on the rise, or do we just know more about it?
I think we definitely know more about it, but definitely ADHD rates tend to be higher in more developed nations because of the use of medications. And so sometimes ADHD can be overdiagnosed in individuals that have, right, those milder presentations, because families are seeking out medication treatment as a first line treatment for them. So in some cases, we're learning more about ADHD and people are starting to recognize ADHD more, particularly in girls and women who are often underdiagnosed and told that their symptoms are more related to an emotional difficulty. But on the other hand, I think some of those milder symptoms get diagnosed as cases of ADHD for the purposes of treatment.
I have to say, I've met more people or heard from more people recently, especially women, who have been diagnosed in their 20s or even 30s. Are there things that parents can do to, really tease out at the younger age, whether it's depression or whether it's ADHD or whether it's, anything else? Because I feel like they would have had a better experience growing up if it had been properly diagnosed to begin with.
A good developmental history can go really far. So oftentimes when you see a community a provider in the community, the provider wants to know what's the problem that's happening right now. And a lot of girls that have ADHD are more prone to developing things like depression and have suicidal thoughts and self-harm. And so it just kind of fits for a lot of people. And it's a heuristic or a bias that people have. If you get a history of when attention difficulties might have started, and then the context in which they occur, that might help, right, the diagnosis of ADHD kind of unfold for someone. I think that's especially true for girls that are more just the inattentive presentation, right? They're not hyper or as impulsive. That's the most difficult because those are the kids that are less noticed, right? The most common referrals, at least at the school level, are for kids that are more disruptive, causing more problems. Teachers need more support. Um, and that tends to be the boys.
Some girls. Um, uh, just picking up on that, you had said that like neuropsych testing or that was of limited value because of the conditions. So the diagnosis should then be dependent more on the input of parents and teachers and other adults involved in the kid's life. Is that the point?
Yeah, so ADHD, to make a diagnosis, it has to be present in two settings. So you need reports from people in two different settings. So the most common is to get a report from a teacher, a core teacher that someone knows and has been their teacher for at least a little while, and from a caregiver. And that you really start to understand sort of where symptoms and impairments are showing up and to what extent. Neuropsych testing can lead to lots of false negatives if someone can pay attention right to this gamified kind of program of attention, because sometimes they can hyper focus if they find it really engaging. They're not always super engaging, but there's no natural distractions in the room that would be present in school. But you can also have false positives. So someone who has depression with a lot of difficulties with sleep, we know that sleep can impact attention. And so that might show up on a neuropsych test as attention being very low, and it's because they weren't sleeping and has nothing to do with having ADHD. So a neuropsych test gives you a picture of what's happening in this moment right now with someone's attention, but that can be influenced by so many things that it doesn't really capture a diagnosis of like ADHD super well.
So life experience is a lot more valuable. I got
Yep.
that. So someone asked earlier, how can you get the school on board with supporting the teen?
Yes. So identifying a point person in school, in middle school and high school, it's usually a counselor that you can develop a trusting relationship with. And then understanding what is it about school that's difficult for a teen. Do we need some accommodations, right? Is it just that they're running out of time? In which case you can work with the school and ask for a 504 plan, and schools have to honor that. Schools will tell you what forms you have to fill out that usually have to be signed by a physician, and you can get a 504 plan. If you suspect that there might be more and that you require testing, that's something that the school is also mandated to do, especially if it's a public school. Private schools or religious schools are a little bit different, but the same sort of point applies of identifying one person to be your point person. Counselors tend to you tend to have the same counselor sometimes through the years in school, or the counseling team is much smaller than just a teacher. And they're really great teachers, but you might not have that teacher, or that teacher might not follow you for the rest of your high school or middle school career. And so identifying someone at the school that's works with mental health, and that's sort of their job title, they can help with planning and setting things in motion at the level of the school.
That's great. I wanted to add that for kids in private schools, it may be that the public school district in which that private school is located has some responsibility with regard to identifying kids who may need accommodations or support. So if your kid's in private school, it's worth asking. Is ADHD a psychological or neurobiological condition?
So ADHD is classified under the neurodevelopmental conditions within psychiatry. So it is a psychiatric condition. It's neurodevelopmental in nature. And like most conditions, there's a mix of what we used to call nature versus nurture of biology and the environment. We can certainly see the biology side in ADHD, for example, in genetics. ADHD is one of the most heritable conditions, with heritability estimates of like up to 0.8, which is really, really high. So we know that there's a strong biological component, but there are so many things in the environment too that can make things much easier or much worse for someone.
So we know that kids' brains continue to develop until around age 25, a little more, a little less. So this could also be applicable to kids who are in college. You know, are there things that are different, the way things manifest, or ways that you can provide support for kids in college, or of the older end of the spectrum, than the ones who are like 12 years old and have managed to sneak under the radar?
Yes. So that's a great question. The core symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity are the same. I think what that looks like is very different depending on the different age ranges. Something that happened in DSM-5 is that now the ADHD rating scales that you see on questionnaires contain developmental descriptors of what this might look like in different age ranges compared to just the symptom. So, for example, a symptom used to be on those questionnaires, right? Loses toys and things for activities. Um, that's not super relevant for someone in college, but misplacing your keys, not being able to find your wallet, um, not knowing where you left your book, whether you left it, in the classroom or in some locker, or it's at home or it's in your car. It's the same symptom. It just looks so different, depending on the age of the person. And that's more reflective now in some of those symptom descriptions.
Well, that's helpful. Nice when they catch up, right? Um, uh, so in terms of ADHD as like a time-bounded or lifelong condition, are there, does therapy, help reduce anything about ADHD? Is this, if you have ADHD as a child, are you always going to have it? What can
Yeah.
you say?
We know that ADHD persists into adolescence at about 70% and into adulthood at 50 to 60%. What therapy can do is help address mostly the impairments. So what are the daily life challenges? Not so much hyperactivity. And we know from different studies, we don't necessarily want to limit people's hyperactivity. There were some studies that if you try to get kids not to fidget, right, to like put their hands on their desk or like tie down their feet so they don't move their feet, they actually end up doing worse. Um, so you don't always control the symptoms themselves of ADHD, right? There's no treatment for improving attention span, but it can help a lot with some of those impairments. That transition from high school into college, right? That magic 18 number is so hard, I think universally across conditions, because in high school you have so many supports, right? You have parents are with you, the school is with you have a medical provider, and then now you're 18 and you make your own decisions and you have to find those supports in college. You might live away from home, and so you have a little less involvement from your parents. Um, the teachers that you see in college, when I think of my freshman year in college, I think of these big 300-person lecture halls, and so that feels very different than like a typical high school class, and very easy to get lost or distracted. And so that transition is especially important for people to, have their care teams set up before they go.
Um, so following up on that, Do you know of any resources or um, workbooks or self-help books or anything that are good for the teens themselves in terms of coping with ADHD?
Most teens are finding information on social media now. I've shared some book recommendations and things like that with teens. In my experience, they're not picking up a book. But they will try to find a video or some kind of influencer that can sort of digest that information and give it to them in a more relatable way. There is one YouTube channel, it's called How to ADHD, um, that gives really great advice. And one of the scientific advisors actually completed his postdoctoral fellow in the same program that I'm in now. So um, I know from experience of having worked with folks that have advised on that channel, um, that they give sound evidence and it could be helpful for teens.
Okay. I'm glad that you're interested in this sleep aspect because I think that's the question that is coming up the most. Um, uh, well, one says, it was reinforcing to hear how critical sleep is for ADHD and depression. What would you suggest if your teen resists sleep hygiene basics or says they don't work for them? And then on the other side, what if your teen says they have a hard time sleeping and then just want to sleep all day?
The hard time sleeping and wanting to sleep all day is something that happens so often because if you sleep during the day, like if you take big naps, it's going to be very hard for you to fall asleep. You're going to wake up feeling super tired, and then you're going to want to take that nap the next day. And so it creates this cycle where there are so many complaints of not being able to sleep, but if you count up all the hours they're getting all their hours, it's just fragmented. So I often tell teens like, let's sacrifice 1 or 2 nights of a nap, and let's pick a non-threatening day to do that. And what I mean by that is a day where you don't have to go to school. So let's pick the weekend, a long weekend like the one we just had, and like on Friday, we're not going to take the nap. We're just going to go to sleep at the time we would go to sleep. And oftentimes, because they're so sleep deprived, they might actually go to sleep a little early and wake up feeling a whole lot better. And a couple days of that can help sort of reset that rhythm for them. There is a lot of resistance, oftentimes when you want to change someone's routine, any kind of routine. And so I always work with teens to pick one thing to change at a time. And sometimes when I get started, I even pick something benign to change, like change one thing about your room just to signal to your body that we're going to make changes to sleep, because your body will pick up on something changed in the room. Um, and that can also be a reward, right? I will help you change something about your room that you've always wanted if you follow these recommendations for sleep. So oftentimes just feeling better and sleeping more is enough to maintain the changes. It's just getting that initial buy-in of making those changes of not having Starbucks at 7 p.m. or watching your show earlier and not staying up super late.
All right. Any suggestions for how introverted teens can reduce ADHD overwhelm in their crowded, smelly, noisy schools that are an assault to their senses?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Um, Introverted and ADHD, which is something that's super common. Um, Oftentimes it's picking one person that you feel close to in each class, so that you have sort of like a buddy system where you can direct your attention to. So you want to direct your attention obviously to class and things that you're doing, but if things feel too much, know that you have a buddy that can help. If that still feels like a lot and can't be managed on its own, working with the school about where a teen could sit, right? If their assigned seat is in an area that's really challenging for them, like if it's close to the door, um, right? Being closer to the teacher can sometimes help. Being in front of the room so that you can't even see the kids oftentimes if you're seated at the front of the room, and so it's less stimulating. those kinds of things at the school level can be helpful too.
That's great. The last thing I want to ask you is about coaching. Uh, there are ADHD coaches. I believe you have an interest in that.
Yes. So we've discovered that there's um, this whole set of providers. They're called ADHD coaches, that provide coaching oftentimes around executive functioning. So, like organization, time management, planning skills for adolescents and adults with ADHD. But not much is known about what they do in those contexts. Um, and one of the things that we're interested in the program that I'm at is understanding what role coaches might have in care for individuals with ADHD. We know that there just aren't enough therapists for the high demand, right? Especially for ADHD, which is the most common youth mental health condition. And so one of the projects we're working on is a survey for coaches to take about the kind of care that they provide so we can characterize that a little better, and hopefully expand the workforce of folks that are seeing individuals with ADHD, to best understand, who would benefit from coaching.
That'd be awesome to be able to, have a set of recommendations and to get an idea of, what you can ask of a coach in terms of helping your kid. Well, this has been fantastic. Carlos, thank you so much for all that you shared with us. Really appreciate your expertise and your time. I want to just encourage people to do the survey, but also visit our website. If you go to familyware.org/trainings, you'll get to our library of webinars, and we have a bunch of different topics in youth mental health, including suicide prevention, which came up a little bit tonight. So thank you all so much. Share this with your friends, share this with the special ed teachers at your school, and always keep hope. There are solutions and there is help. Thank you all. Take care.